The urban explorers were a group united by a common fascination, the search for places forgotten by time. They were young, curious, and driven by the adrenaline that came with each discovery. Sarah, the group's leader, had a thing for old stories, especially those involving haunted or abandoned places. Gabriel, the group's photographer, captured the images that no one else dared to look at up close. He always believed that each abandoned building held its own stories, waiting to be revealed. Lucas and Marina, the other two members, were attracted by the mystery and danger that these places offered, and liked the idea of venturing where few dared. It was during an afternoon of research, while browsing internet forums dedicated to abandoned places, that Sarah came across a reference to an old hospital located in a remote and forgotten region. The building, surrounded by tall trees and an atmosphere of complete abandonment, had been closed for over 40 years after a series of unexplained incidents. The information was vague, almost as if someone was trying to keep the place hidden, but this only increased the group's curiosity. The hospital didn't appear on modern maps, and any mention of it seemed to be deliberately obscure. The temptation was immediate. An abandoned hospital, full of history and possibly secrets, was exactly the kind of place the group would love to explore. Sarah shared the discovery with the others, and soon everyone was excited at the prospect of a new adventure. The idea of walking through the corridors of a hospital that hadn't seen a living soul for decades was irresistible. However, along with the excitement came warnings. Old comments on the forums spoke of unexplained disappearances associated with the hospital, of visitors who went in search of adventure and never came back. There were also reports of strange sounds coming from inside the building at night, as if something or someone was still active inside. And of course, there was the local legend about the horrific experiments that were allegedly carried out there in the last days of the hospital's operation, before it was mysteriously closed down. Lucas, ever the skeptic, laughed at the stories, considering them exaggerations to scare curious people like them. Gabriel, on the other hand, mentioned that every legend has a grain of truth, but he was equally excited about the opportunity to capture unique images. Marina, who loved a good mystery, suggested that they investigate further before making a final decision, but deep down, they all knew they would. Despite the warnings and the fear that the stories evoked, the group decided to go ahead. The legends circulating about the hospital only made the adventure seem even more exciting. For them, it was just another chance to explore the unknown and find out for themselves whether the stories were real or not. After all, they believed that the real adventure only begins when you decide to ignore the fear of the unknown. And so it was, with their hearts racing and their flashlights ready, that they began the journey that would change their lives forever. The morning was grey when the group of explorers finally arrived at the site. The abandoned hospital loomed in front of them, like a sleeping giant, lost amidst the vegetation that had grown rampant over the years. The road that led there was little more than a dirt track, covered in dry leaves and fallen branches, suggesting that few people had visited the place in recent decades. Sarah was the first out of the car, her heart pounding. There was something strange about the atmosphere around the hospital. The air seemed heavier, almost oppressive, as if the place itself was aware of their presence. She looked at her friends, who also seemed to feel the weight of the environment. Gabriel slung his camera around his neck, always ready to capture any interesting detail. Lucas and Marina, despite trying to keep their composure, exchanged nervous glances, as if they were reconsidering their decision to be there. The hospital was even more imposing up close. The windows were broken or covered in dust and cobwebs, and the main doors, made of rusty metal, seemed sealed by time. Faded brick walls, covered in a layer of moss and old graffiti, told a story of abandonment and oblivion. Even from a distance, they could see the faded letters that formed the hospital's name, almost illegible, but still exuding a long-lost presence of authority. With a brief exchange of glances, They decided it was time to go in. Lucas, being the bravest of the group, or at least wanting to seem that way, pushed the doors open with considerable effort. They opened with an ominous creak, revealing an interior filled with darkness. The cold air coming out of the hospital made everyone shiver. Marina squeezed Sarah's arm, trying to ignore the instinct that told her to get back in the car and drive away. As their eyes adjusted to the dimness, they could see the gloomy interior of the hospital. The main lobby, once a place of movement and life, was now deserted, with old papers strewn across the floor, overturned wheelchairs and a reception desk that looked as if it had been hastily abandoned. Gabriel started taking photos, the flash briefly illuminating the darkest corners, revealing details they'd rather not see. Stains on the floor that looked old but were still sharp, and marks on the walls that suggested sudden movements, as if someone had struggled to get out. As they advanced through the corridors, the silence was almost absolute, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing off the empty walls. The group moved cautiously, feeling the presence of the place palpably. Each room they passed seemed to tell a dark story. Abandoned medical instruments, rusty stretchers, and patient rooms still with their mattresses, as if they were ready to receive occupants who had never arrived. At one point, Marina stopped suddenly, holding Sarah's arm tightly. She had heard something, a distant sound, almost imperceptible, but real. It was like a whisper coming from somewhere ahead. The group stopped, exchanging anxious glances, trying to identify the source of the sound, but silence reigned again, leaving them uncertain whether they had really heard something or whether it was just their imaginations playing tricks. Even so, they decided to continue, convinced that they were just getting carried away by their surroundings. Deep down, a part of each of them wanted to believe that it was all just an ordinary exploration, like so many others. However, the tension was undeniable. Each step into the hospital seemed to increase the weight on their shoulders, as if they were being watched by invisible but vigilant eyes. It was then, while exploring a side wing, that Lucas tripped over something on the floor, a fallen shelf, partially covered in dust. As he tried to balance himself, he noticed something peculiar. A hidden door behind the shelf, almost imperceptible, which was not on any plan or map they had consulted before. It was a simple door, made of rusty metal, but the fact that it was hidden immediately aroused everyone's curiosity. Sarah approached, shining her flashlight through the door. There was no sign indicating where it led, and the hinges were so rusty that it looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The group exchanged hesitant glances, but the desire to find out what was behind that door overcame any fear. With a joint effort, they managed to open the door, which moved with a frightening creak, revealing a narrow, steep staircase that descended into what looked like a basement. The smell of mold and something else, something metallic and strange, rose from the depths, causing Marina to recoil for a moment. But the group was determined to keep going. After all, they hadn't come this far to give up now. One by one, they descended the steps, Sarah's flashlight lighting the way ahead. Each step echoed off the damp walls, adding to the feeling that they were venturing into forbidden territory. And in their hearts, they all knew that they were not prepared for what they would find down there. The air in the basement was dense, heavy, and laden with humidity. Sarah's flashlight trembled slightly in her hands as she illuminated what seemed to be a narrow, poorly lit corridor. The walls were covered in white tiles, now yellowed by time, and the floor was cold, uneven concrete. The group advanced with cautious steps, each feeling a growing knot in their stomach, as if they knew they had crossed an invisible line. Just ahead, they spotted a partially open metal door. A rusty plaque hung from a nearby chain. The words almost faded, but still legible. Restricted access. That inscription seemed like a late warning, but none of them were willing to stop now. Gabriel, always the most curious, was the first to cautiously push the door. The metal creaked ominously as it opened, revealing the interior of a room that immediately made their blood run cold. The room was large, much bigger than they had expected, and filled with a series of rusty metal tables covered in dirty, dusty cloths. On one wall, there were shelves crammed with old vials, some still containing strangely colored liquids. In the center, a stretcher, equipped with deteriorated leather straps, was positioned under a spotlight that hung from the ceiling, still intact, but now without electricity. The group remained motionless for a moment, absorbing the macabre scene. Sarah finally mustered the courage to approach one of the tables. When she pulled out one of the cloths, she revealed a series of old surgical instruments, scalpels, tweezers, saws, all covered in rust, and in some cases with dark stains that suggested a dark use. The metallic smell they had smelled earlier seemed to come from these instruments, an odor that mixed rust and something more pungent. "My God, what were they doing here?" murmured Marina, her voice almost inaudible. No one answered. The truth was that everyone had an idea of what the room represented, but no one wanted to be the first to voice their thoughts. It was then that Lucas, rummaging through a pile of papers in a corner of the room, found something even more disturbing: a series of documents detailing the experiments carried out there. The pages were stained and worn, but the content was undeniable. Detailed descriptions of medical procedures, many of which sounded more like torture than treatment. Some of the patients were referred to only by numbers, without names, but the notes of the doctor in charge revealed a deeply disturbed mind. He talked about breakthroughs and discoveries, but in an increasingly frantic tone, as if he was convinced he was about to accomplish something great or monstrous. As Lucas read aloud, the horror on his friends' faces only grew. The experiments seemed to focus on methods of prolonging life or inducing altered states of consciousness, but what disturbed them most was the realization that the patients had not survived. The doctor in charge, whose signature at the end of each document was a mark of his insanity, seemed to have continued his experiments even after the patients had died, trying to extract something that he only referred to as the essence. Just then, a sudden noise made everyone turn quickly towards the entrance to the room. It sounded like a distant whisper, but no one could identify the source. Gabriel quickly raised his camera, trying to capture something, but all he got were shaky images of the empty room. However, the silence that followed was more disturbing than the sound itself. It was as if the hospital itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what they would do next. Suddenly, the room seemed colder. A current of air, which shouldn't exist in such a closed place, passed through them, causing everyone to shiver. It was Marina who noticed it first. A shadow, indistinct, moving in the corner of the room where the torchlight couldn't quite reach. It didn't look solid, but it still had an undeniable presence, a vaguely human shape that seemed to be watching them intently. "We need to get out of here," said Lucas, his voice now firm, trying to hide his growing fear. No one objected. Sarah started backing towards the door, keeping her flashlight fixed on the shadow that, to everyone's horror, seemed to start moving towards them. As soon as they crossed the threshold, they slammed it shut, their hearts beating frantically. But the relief was momentary. The hospital, which had once been a sinister presence, now seemed to pulse with an evil energy. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the silence that enveloped them was even more oppressive than the noise. They had seen enough. They knew that this was no ordinary exploration. They had touched something that should have remained forgotten. In their haste to leave, they started running back down the corridor they had come from, but each step seemed to echo like a drumbeat of warnings. Gabriel, still trying to capture something with his camera, tripped and fell, dropping the camera on the floor. When he picked it up, the lens was cracked, but he could see something in the viewfinder that chilled his blood. The shadow they had left behind was no longer there. It was now ahead, as if it were waiting for them on the way back. Without wasting any time, the group kept running, fighting the growing sense of panic. They needed to get out of that place, and fast, before the shadow, or whatever else inhabited that hospital, caught up with them. The basement, the experiment room, everything seemed to close in on their memories. But one thing was certain: they wouldn't be able to leave that experience behind so easily. The hospital had marked them in a way that none of them yet fully understood, but deep down, they all knew that the real terror was yet to come. Sarah's heart was beating so fast that she could feel the blood pulsing in her ears. Every step the group took towards the hospital exit seemed like an eternity. The corridor that had once seemed simple and short now stretched on endlessly, the shadows lengthening and writhing around them, as if the building itself was trying to keep them trapped. Gabriel, still holding the damaged camera, was at the front, trying to stay calm while lighting the way with his flashlight. Behind him, Marina was breathing heavily, anxiety taking over, while Lucas and Sarah closed in on the queue, constantly looking back, afraid to see the shadow they had left behind emerge again. The corridor seemed alive. The walls creaked and crackled, as if the hospital was moving around them, reorganizing itself to confuse its prey. Lucas felt cold sweat dripping down his forehead, the feeling that something was very wrong growing by the second. Suddenly, he felt an invisible hand pull his backpack back. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the dark emptiness of the corridor. "Did you feel that?" Lucas asked, his voice full of panic. "We have to keep going," Sarah replied urgently, trying to ignore the growing fear in her chest. She knew that if they stopped, they might lose their chance to escape. They turned a corner, trying to find their way through the maze of corridors that now all looked the same. The closed doors along the walls seemed to jealously guard the horrible secrets they had witnessed. For a moment, Gabriel stopped abruptly, causing the others to almost collide with him. What he saw ahead made his blood run cold. The path they were supposed to follow was blocked by debris falling from the ceiling, making it impossible to pass through. "This wasn't here before," Marina whispered, her voice shaking. They would have to find another way. Suddenly, a piercing sound reverberated through the corridors, a shrill, agonizing scream that seemed to echo from every direction. It was an inhuman sound, full of pain and despair, as if the walls of the hospital were screaming in unison. The sound made everyone stop in shock, their hearts racing. That scream wasn't from a living person, but it wasn't something their minds could ignore either. "Come on, hurry!" shouted Gabriel, forcing the group to move again. They turned towards a side corridor, an alternative route that they hoped would lead them back to the main exit. But every step seemed to be a struggle against the building itself, which was now clearly turning against them. As they ran, the lights of their flashlights began to fail, flickering and weakening, as if sucked into the surrounding darkness. Sarah was about to suggest that they stop and try to fix the lanterns when something more disturbing happened. The shadows in the corners of the corridor began to move independently, detaching themselves from the walls and taking on vaguely human shapes. They were dark figures, without faces, but clearly full of evil intent. Marina let out an involuntary scream as one of these shadows moved towards her, and she stepped back, colliding with Lucas. The darkness seemed to condense around them, making the air dense and difficult to breathe. The whispers, which had once been distant and almost inaudible, were now everywhere, penetrating their ears, whispering words they couldn't understand, but which sounded threatening. Finally, they spotted the hospital's front door, a beacon of hope in the midst of the oppressive darkness. But as soon as they approached, the door seemed to move away, as if the corridor was intentionally lengthening to keep them in. Desperation and panic overtook them, but they kept running, forcing their bodies forward even as their minds screamed at them to stop. Lucas was the first to reach the door. With a desperate impulse, he pushed with all his might, hoping it was locked, but to his relief, the door gave way, opening with a bang. The cold night air rushed in, bringing with it a breath of reality, and they stepped out into freedom, panting and panicked. Outside, the night was darker than they remembered, and the silence was almost as oppressive as the one inside the hospital. None of them spoke immediately, the shock of what had just happened still holding them in silence. They looked at the hospital, which now seemed to be just an old abandoned building, harmless and inert. But they all knew that what they had experienced inside was no illusion. Finally, Gabriel broke the silence. "We need to get out of here," he said, still holding the camera that had captured everything, but which now felt like a dead weight in his hands. The group didn't argue. They climbed into the car quickly, still panting, and started to drive away from the hospital. But none of them could help looking back at the dark silhouette of the hospital in the rear-view mirror, as if they were leaving a part of themselves behind. As the car sped down the road, each of them tried to process what had happened, but deep down, they knew it wasn't over. The hospital had marked them in a way that they still couldn't understand. And as they drove away in silence, a feeling of unease persisted, a dark certainty that something was following them, something that couldn't be left behind so easily. Returning to the city should have brought relief, but the weight of what they had experienced in the abandoned hospital seemed to follow the group like an invisible shadow. The days following the escape were strangely silent, each of the explorers trying to return to normality, but finding it difficult to shake off the memories of that night. Sarah was the first to notice that something was wrong. Ever since leaving the hospital, she had been plagued by vivid nightmares. She dreamt constantly of the experiment room, the rusty instruments, and the shadows that seemed to be in every corner. In her sleep, she relived the feeling of growing dread, and when she woke up, she felt tired, as if she hadn't slept at all. But the dreams weren't the only thing troubling her. In her house, she began to notice small details out of place, furniture that seemed to have been moved, doors that opened by themselves, and, even worse, the distant echo of whispers, the same ones they had heard in the corridors of the hospital. Gabriel, on the other hand, was obsessed with the images he had captured with his camera. He spent hours reviewing the footage, trying to understand what exactly they had seen in that hospital. The first few times he watched the video, everything seemed normal, until he began to notice indistinct shapes, rapid movements in the background of the footage that he didn't remember seeing while he was there. Shadows that moved unnaturally, almost as if they were aware of the camera, watching. In one of the recordings, he saw something that made him pause the video and shudder. A misty figure, standing at the back of the experiment room, looking directly at the camera, even though no eyes were visible. Gabriel abruptly switched off the computer, but the image remained etched in his mind, reappearing every time he closed his eyes. Marina, always sensitive to her surroundings, began to notice a subtle change in her own home. The plants she kept in her apartment, once vibrant and healthy, began to wilt for no apparent reason. The air seemed heavier, as if there was an invisible presence sucking the energy out of the place. She tried to ignore it, but she couldn't avoid the constant feeling that she was being watched, especially at night, when shadows danced on the walls of her room, taking on almost human forms, but always out of focus. Lucas, who had been the most skeptical from the start, was now fighting a growing paranoia. He began to avoid being alone, and his daily routine became erratic. At work, his colleagues noticed that he was constantly distracted, staring at nothing as if waiting for something to appear. At home, he kept all the lights on, but the feeling of being followed never went away. Lucas also began to have rapid visions, almost like hallucinations, of hands emerging from the walls, trying to grab him, disappearing as soon as he blinked. The impact of the hospital wasn't just psychological. Each member of the group began to suffer strange little accidents, cuts, bruises, burns, that they couldn't explain. It was as if the place, or something connected to it, was trying to hurt them, even from a distance. The physical marks were a constant reminder that whatever they had found in the hospital was still with them. Sarah, unable to cope alone with the growing terror that haunted her, decided to investigate more about the hospital. She went back to the old records, looking for additional information about the experiments and the doctor who had commanded that hell. Her research revealed that the hospital had been closed down after a series of mysterious and unexplained deaths among patients and staff. The main doctor, whose name was signed on the documents they found, was reported missing, but rumor had it that he had continued his work in secret in an unknown location. These discoveries, instead of providing answers, only increased Sarah's fear. She began to believe that the doctor, or something he had awakened, was still somehow connected to them. Determined to share her findings with the others, she organized a meeting at her home, hoping that together they could understand what was happening and find a way to free themselves from the hospital's influence. When the group got together, the changes in everyone were visible. Everyone was paler, tired, with deep dark circles under their eyes and eyes that revealed sleepless nights. Everyone shared their experiences since leaving the hospital, and the realization was clear. The place had marked them in a way that they couldn't simply ignore. "We need to go back," Gabriel suggested, the idea echoing in the air like a sentence. Everyone was silent for a moment, considering what this meant. The mere idea of returning to the hospital was terrifying, but they knew that the alternative, continuing to live under the shadow of what they had found, was unbearable. Marina was the first to agree. "If we don't do something, it will consume us," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. Lucas and Sarah, although hesitant, knew she was right. The hospital hadn't finished with them, and somehow they needed to confront what they had awakened in order to free themselves. With this decision, the group began to plan a return to the hospital, this time not as curious explorers, but as survivors determined to confront the evil they had unearthed. They knew that what awaited them there was beyond comprehension, but they had no other choice. The only way out was to face the terror head-on, even if it meant risking their lives or their souls. The night of their return to the hospital came faster than any of them expected. Each member of the group felt the weight of the decision as they reconvened in the place that promised to be the stage for their final confrontation. The abandoned hospital loomed before them, even more imposing and threatening than they remembered. The ancient structure seemed to pulse with an ominous energy, as if it knew they were coming back and was waiting for them. This time, they were better prepared, or so they thought. They had brought more powerful flashlights, video cameras, and even some protective gear in the hope that anything physical they encountered could be kept at bay. But deep down, they all knew that the real threat was something far beyond the tangible. They entered in silence, the tension between them palpable. The interior of the hospital was just as gloomy as last time, but now it seemed to be waiting for them. The silence was not just an absence of sound, but a presence in itself, as if the building was watching their every move. Following the familiar corridors, the group soon reached the door that would take them back to the basement where it all began. This time, there was no hesitation. With a firmness they could barely sustain, they opened the door and started down the stairs, lighting the way ahead. When they reached the basement, the experiment room seemed even more oppressive. The same dust-covered tables, the rusty instruments, and the stretcher in the center. Everything was exactly as they had left it. But there was something different in the air, a sense of anticipation, as if the hospital itself was waiting for this moment. "We have to find out what's holding us here," said Sarah, trying to keep calm. She approached the pile of documents that Lucas had found on the previous visit. This time, she was determined to find something, anything, that would explain what they were up against. Gabriel adjusted his camera and started filming, trying to capture any anomalies. He didn't believe that filming could save their lives, but he felt that recording whatever was happening there was his only way of keeping tabs on the situation. As the group explored the room, he noticed something that made him freeze. On the monitor of his camera, An indistinct figure appeared at the back of the room, exactly where he had captured the shadow in the previous shot. But this time, it wasn't still. It was getting closer. "There's something here," Gabriel began, his voice breaking as the figure disappeared from the monitor. The others turned to him, their faces filled with dread. The air around them began to stir, as if an invisible storm was brewing. It was then that the lantern lights began to flicker again, and the chill in the room became unbearable. The shadows on the walls began to distort and take shape, writhing as if they were alive. The hospital was reacting to their presence, and not in a friendly way. Suddenly, the doors of the room slammed shut, locking them in. Panic gripped the group, but there was nowhere to run. The shadow Gabriel had seen now manifested itself more clearly, taking shape in the center of the room, a tall, indistinct figure that seemed made of pure hatred and despair. "It's the doctor," Marina whispered, her voice trembling. They understood immediately. The disturbed spirit of the doctor who had carried out those horrible experiments was trapped there, and somehow, by invading his domain, they had aroused his anger. The shadows began to advance on them, but this time the group was prepared to fight. Sarah, with a courage she didn't know she possessed, began shouting at the figure, demanding answers. She brandished the documents they had found, accusing the spirit of having condemned all the patients to death for its insane experiments. But the spirit only seemed to grow stronger with the words, becoming more solid, more present. Gabriel, in a moment of desperation, threw the camera at the shadow, hoping to distract whatever it was. To his surprise, the impact made the shadow waver, as if for an instant it had lost its connection with the place. Lucas, realizing this, quickly began destroying the objects in the room, breaking instruments, tearing up papers, anything that might be keeping the spirit connected to the physical world. The whole hospital seemed to react violently to the attack, the walls shaking, the floor cracking. But the doctor's shadow began to weaken, its outline slowly fading as the group destroyed the remains of his macabre work. Finally, with one last scream that sounded like a mixture of anger and pain, the shadow dissipated, leaving the room in a sepulchral silence. The doors of the room opened by themselves, as if the hospital was releasing them from their prison. The group, shaken and exhausted, began to leave, without looking back. There was nothing more to see there, nothing more to face. Whatever it was over. As they walked down the corridor towards the exit, the atmosphere around them began to lighten. The hospital, which had once seemed like a living, evil entity, was now nothing more than an old, crumbling building. The air was lighter, the silence was no longer oppressive, but a simple absence of sound. When they finally stepped out into the cold night, the relief was immediate, but mixed with a deep exhaustion. They knew that the experience had changed them forever, and that the scars of that night would remain with them, even if the doctor's spirit was finally at peace. On the way back, the group remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. They knew that they could never really forget what they had seen and experienced in that hospital, but they also knew that somehow they had overcome the terror. However, when Gabriel, now in the passenger seat, briefly reviewed the camera he had retrieved, he stopped and felt a shiver run up his spine. In one of the last recordings, captured as the doctor's spirit disappeared, there was a figure in the background, barely visible, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. He decided not to mention it to the others. For now, they deserved to believe that the nightmare was over. But deep down, he knew that the hospital's legacy might never leave them completely. And so, as they walked away, the abandoned hospital was left behind, as still and silent as ever, but with the feeling that, although the explorers had escaped, the evil that resided there was only lying dormant, waiting for its next chance to manifest itself.